Hello! In this video we are going to take a look at Aristotelian virtue ethics. Now I'm going to explore Aristotle's virtue ethics over two videos. This video will set out more or less the basics, and the next video will take a look in a little bit more detail. There are quite a few terms that you need to know how to deploy in relation to Aristotelian virtue ethics. So to begin with, we'll just look at these, and then how they are used should become clearer as we go along. So key terms you need to know. Above all, you need to know the term eudaimonia, okay? And that means the flourishing life. Now, some secondary texts translate eudaimonia as happiness. Now, this is not quite right, or rather, it's misleading, because happiness makes you think of perhaps more of a psychological state, and that's something that utilitarians sort of think about more, happiness as a psychological state. Eudaimonia really is about contentment and flourishing. In other words, it's not just about being happy, it's about learning how to cope well with suffering as well, okay? And learning, how to discipline yourself to make sure that you don't end up being excessive in your life, and you don't end up being deficient in your life. More of that later. But it is the flourishing life is the ultimate goal of all human beings. All right. Now, eudaimonia is closely related to another Greek term, arete, which is more or less excellence, and in the case of virtue ethics can be understood as excellence of character. Now, ergon, again, another Greek term. This is function. Now, the function of a human being is to exercise their rationality in pursuit of eudaimonia. All right, so it's the function argument. Everything has a function. The function of a bag is to carry things. The function of a radio is to transmit information and entertainment, and so on. And the function of a human being, because of the qualities that we have, is to exercise our rationality in relation to our final and ultimate purpose, which is eudaimonia and the flourishing life. All right, and through that function as well, we develop our character. And you'll see, I hope, how all this works out shortly. But of course, learning how to develop your rationality, develop your character, and achieve eudaimonia requires practice. All right, and practice will eventually mean that you become sort of fluent in something. It will become habit. So this is this idea of habituation that Aristotle also talks about. Quite a good example, those of you who are learning to drive perhaps, you'll find that the first few lessons it's terribly sort of difficult in terms of thinking about everything that you need to do, mirror, signal, look both ways, etc., and you'll change gear, clutch down, brake, all of those things that you have to really concentrate on in the first few lessons. Suddenly, at some point, you'll just go, oh, I was doing that without thinking. All right, so then you've become habituated. Your practice has led you in a way that means that you no longer have to think about something, it's part of you. And Aristotle is thinking about habituation in terms of the development of character. All right, so let's say, for example, you might not be a particularly compassionate person, and you think that in order to develop your character, you need to be more compassionate. To begin with, that might be quite difficult, and you have to practice, but over time, the more you practice, the easier it becomes, and before you know it, you have become a compassionate person through habituation. All right, so it's practicing in a way that allows whatever it is to become a habit. Okay. Then there's the doctrine of the mean. Now, this is a central idea in virtue ethics. All right, and again, it's related to the above four terms. All right, it's the idea that we can develop our character and achieve the overall purpose of eudaimonia through finding the right balance between excess and deficiency. So, for example, you might be one of those people who perhaps doesn't talk enough at parties or at social gatherings, so you need to practice being a little bit more conversational. On the other hand, you might be somebody who talks too much, and so you've got to rein it in a little bit. Okay, and So the idea is that you identify within yourself these characteristics of either talking too much or talking too little or whatever it is, and you practice getting the right amount of conversation in different contexts. All right, and this applies to absolutely anything. That was just my conversation example. All right, but you can drink too much and drink too little. You can be too compassionate or not compassionate enough, and the idea is that you find the ideal, which exists between excess on the one hand, too much compassion or too much conversation, and deficiency on the other, too little compassion or too little conversation. Finally, Aristotle talks a little bit about voluntary and involuntary actions, and it's obviously through voluntary action that we develop our character, because of course those actions that we can't help, whatever they are, obviously if you can't help something, you can't be held responsible for doing it. All right, or if you can't help not doing something, you can't be held responsible for not doing it. So there's a great deal of emphasis on voluntary action in relation to the development of character. So let's now go back to the basics. Okay, virtue ethics is a teleological theory, so it's a theory based on purpose, right? And as I've already explained, the ultimate purpose of everything for a human being is to achieve eudaimonia, and that's the flourishing life. Arete, again, a central part of virtue ethics. It's often translated as virtue as well, so arete roughly translates as excellence or virtue, and it should be applied to character in the case of virtue ethics. So we're talking about virtue of character or excellence of character. Eudaimonia, as I hope you know now, is the flourishing life, translates as flourishing, and I'll make the point once again that some secondary literature does talk about it as happiness, but this is misleading because of course it's not just talking about happiness as a psychological state, it's referring much more to the idea of contentment and thriving, all right, which doesn't always equate to happiness. Then, of course, there's function, and the function of a human being is to exercise reason in the pursuit of all of these things. And, as I said, together with purpose, the idea of character is at the centre of virtue ethics, and it's vital for achieving arete. Right? So character is a vital part of achieving arete. Arete in virtue ethics can really be thought of, once you've achieved it, as excellence of character, and this is achieved through the application of the doctrine of the mean. All right. Now, one of the things that we will be looking at in the later stages of the Aristotle videos is how virtue ethics relates to the two other normative ethics that you need to look at, which are utilitarianism and Kant's deontological approach. So I'm just going to ask you now to pause the video and in 5 minutes come up with 4 character traits that you would consider to be virtues in someone. Okay, so let's now look in more detail at how Aristotle builds his idea of virtue ethics. All right, now it's all done in a book called Nicomachean Ethics, which is named after his son. And Aristotle says that when we act in ways, we almost always make sense of how we act by contextualizing what we're doing within a framework of purposes. Why did you do that? I did that because I wanted to do this. So that's a purpose, right? Why did you go to the shop? I went to the shop because I needed some bread and milk. Okay, again, your action is being framed in terms of purposes. All right, and so the act of going to the shop was performed for the sake of something else, and then we can ask what the purpose of obtaining food and drink and so on actually is. All right, again, you attend your classes for the purposes of achieving an A-level. The purpose of achieving an A-level maybe is to improve one's understanding and perhaps obtain a place at university, although not necessarily, that's just an example. And again, these purposes can be subsumed under further purposes such as gaining a more advanced education, Depending on one's outlook and the state of the economy, you might talk about better paid employment, or you might talk about a deepened understanding of what it means to be human. But however you contextualize it, however you rationalize it, it is nonetheless within a framework of purposes. All right, so that's kind of Aristotle's starting point. So in the end, we reach a point where no further questions regarding purposes can be asked. Okay, and this is eudaimonia, right? This point is the goal or end of an action, and it is what makes all the previous actions worthwhile. So what we were talking about in terms of education, going to university, why one does that, what the purpose of it is, and so on, all of those things are driving towards the ultimate end or the ultimate purpose of eudaimonia. So the good of our actions is dependent on the absolute good, right? What we do is dependent on the absolute good, and this absolute good is at the origin of every chain of purposes and is known as eudaimonia. So, as I say, Aristotle believed that no one would want their life to be unsuccessful. No one would genuinely want to work towards a life of futility. They might accidentally do it, but it would just be because of being mistaken rather than a deliberate move. And similarly, one or two good deeds will not be enough to achieve eudaimonia. And it was Aristotle, not Shakespeare, as some people believe, that was the person who first coined the phrase, "one swallow does not make a summer." In other words, a swallow is a bird that is a harbinger of fine weather, and when you see one in spring, you think, fine weather will just be round the corner, summer is here. And Aristotle says, look, just one example of something doesn't mean that it's summer. Okay, one good act doesn't make you a good person, right? You need an actual character that's good. All right. The purpose of that is to develop our character and work towards eudaimonia. So, according to Aristotle, moral virtue is not actually innate, but it can't wholly be achieved through teaching either. Rather, he thinks it is acquired through continuous practice, that's habituation, and application. And it can be lost if it falls into disuse. So there's a sense in which there might be a sort of paradox here, right? On the one hand, you have to practice continuously to develop your character in order to achieve eudaimonia. You can't actually get to a point where you say, right, I've achieved eudaimonia and now I'm going to put my feet up. Because as soon as you put your feet up and go, well, I've done it now, I'm not going to bother again, that's complacency. All right, and that's something that is not a good character trait. All right, so there's a sense in which the achievement of eudaimonia is the continuous practice of trying to develop your character. There's no sort of end point where you can say, right, I've done that and that's it. All right, so it's very, very important to remain aware of that. Okay, so moral virtue is not merely the result of intellect or emotion. Now we come to this notion of voluntary action as well, and part of developing one's character and becoming someone of good character is making the right choices, of choosing well. All right, and choosing, as Aristotle points out, is choosing a good way of life, and that obviously needs to be spelt out. What is it? What is a good way of life? Well, the first thing to note is that our choices are voluntary. All right, you can't choose to perform an action that is involuntary. So our characters are defined largely by what we choose to do. All right, and in this, Aristotle provides this doctrine of the mean, this idea that we'll be faced with all sorts of choices, and we have to judge for ourselves what the best way of acting is. All right, so we have to look at our choices and work out which ones are excessive and which ones are deficient. All right. So we should avoid drinking too much, which would be excessive, but also avoid drinking too little, which would be deficient. In conversation, as I said earlier, we should avoid talking too much, but also avoid talking too little. In order to be courageous, we must avoid rashness, but we should also avoid cowardice. All right? So this is how the doctrine of the mean works, and through practice, through coming to understand our own characters and whether we have a tendency to be excessive in some things and deficient in others, learning how to understand ourselves and then applying that to the doctrine of the mean as well. All right, and through practice, we will get better. And this is this idea of habituation and how it relates to the doctrine of the mean. All right, so achieving arete, achieving excellence, achieving virtue relies on developing the skill of understanding how to achieve the mean. And there's no set way of doing this. So this is an important distinction between virtue ethics and utilitarianism and Kant's deontological approach. Both Kant and utilitarians are prescriptive. In other words, they tell you exactly what to do. Right? So for a utilitarian, an action is good insofar as it creates aggregate happiness and minimizes pain. And for Kant, a maxim is moral, an action guiding principle is moral, provided it can be universalized. Right? Now, there's no such prescription in Aristotle. Right? Everyone is different, and so what counts as the mean between excess and deficiency varies from person to person. All right. And Aristotle provides an analogy to demonstrate this point. He says, in the early part of Nicomachean Ethics, an Olympic athlete requires a different amount of food, and often food of a different kind, to the novice runner. Okay, so what is a balanced diet for the Olympic athlete would not be a balanced diet for somebody who'd just taken up running as a hobby. All right, or indeed someone who didn't really do much physical exercise at all. The dietary requirements might be different. Okay, so you have to look at the context as well in which you're acting, in addition to judging an action to be excessive or deficient outside of that. So it's all woven in as a sort of self-contained idea. All right, it's all woven into each other, or each part is woven into the other. Is a better way of putting it. So we have to find out what the right amount of everything is for ourselves. It can't be prescribed by someone else, which of course is what both utilitarians and Kantians believe. Now, of course, there is this question of whether or not virtue is innate. Now, Aristotle claims it's not exactly innate, but it's not wholly teachable either, because everyone is different. All right. Now, arete does not just concern actions, but also emotions, and that's another distinction you can make between virtue ethics and Kant. Kant rules out what he calls inclinations or emotions from moral decision making. Aristotle believes that you have to be mindful of them. So, again, to emphasize the point, we can have too many fears or too few, too much anger or too little, too much melancholy or too little, and so on. Okay, so again, there's this idea of practice until these things become embedded in your character, and then of course your character has changed because they're now habit. So you're one step further on to achieving eudaimonia. Okay, but again, there's the right amount of each that we have to discover for ourselves, and that is appropriate to each of us individually. So arete is like a craft, it's like a skill. And once you've achieved it, then you have that skill. So it's rather like a carpenter. If you start off in carpentry, you're not going to be particularly good at it to begin with, but after you've practiced and become extremely proficient, you have this craft or art that you're able to practice well. And the same is true, Aristotle believes, in terms of character. Okay, so you might start off as a person with not a poor character necessarily, but somebody who's not very good at judging what needs to happen in a particular situation. So of course that will reflect on your character. All right. Now, I've talked a lot about habituation already, but if we just go over this slide, okay, so the habituation process begins as we intentionally exercise our mind and body to do virtuous acts. All right, so developing our excellence of character is like a craft such as carpentry. It takes practice, and eventually there'll be things that you do that you just don't think about anymore, where at the beginning you had to really, really kind of concentrate. Okay, and again that goes for the conversation example that I talked about earlier as well. All right, and once these things, as I say, become second nature, then that is actually a development and change in your character. So virtues are kind of to be understood as means, or as in averages. All right, you can't have too much of a virtue, and you can't have too little of a virtue, because otherwise those things aren't virtues. So to be a virtue, it has to be the right amount of whatever it is. All right, so compassion is only a virtue if it is deployed or applied in the right amount. All right, it's not a virtue if that's not the case. All right. Now that might lead you to think that virtue ethics is a theory of mediocrity, but that wouldn't be quite right. All right. A lot of people have raised this as an objection to it, but it wouldn't be quite right, because of course, too much compassion, you can't just say compassion is a virtue. You have to say compassion is a virtue when applied appropriately. All right. So applying something appropriately doesn't mean that you're mediocre. Right. It means that you're appropriate. It means that you've judged things well. All right. If you are too compassionate or not compassionate enough, then those would be grounds for criticism. So you can't say that compassion is always a virtue. It's only a virtue when it is correctly applied. All right. Similarly, once we've understood what the right amount of conversation is and what it takes to be courageous, we've got the right kind of prescription to achieve good character. Again, conversation is a virtue, but not always. Right? Courage is a virtue, but not always. It depends upon the context and the situation. So, again, it's not a theory of mediocrity in that sense. It's about the appropriate application of these things to an action. All right. So virtue is not mediocrity in that sense. Virtue is a virtue. Now, Aristotle does exclude certain actions and passions from the doctrine of the mean. So, he excludes murder and jealousy, because you can't have too many or too few murders, right? It's wrong by definition. Similarly, you can't have too much or too little jealousy. In both cases, the intellect does not play any kind of role in tempering excess or deficiency, because jealousy is an excess, right? And murder is an excess. So there's no kind of right amount of those things. So I'm going to leave it there for now, and in the next video, as you can see in front of you, we are going to look at the idea of practical wisdom, okay, phronesis, and that practical wisdom sort of comes out of having practiced and developed through habituation, developed excellence of character and so on. All right, so we'll look at that in the next video.